We are going to get started. We know more people are going to join, but it is 3 o'clock and we have a lot to go over. So my name is Christy Orr, and I am the Director of Disability Resources. I recognize a lot of your little pictures or names here on the screen. And I am here with Justin Romack, who is one of the Assistant Directors in Disability Resources, and who's really been a lead for us in the last year and a half to 2 years on some of our conversations about absence accommodations and most recently the flex plan. So a couple of housekeeping things. We are happy to have you here, either listening now or on the recording, which we are going to make available to those people who requested it. So we do want you to be aware that this is being recorded and it will be shared with faculty members, as well as we will have it available for our disability resources academic liaisons on their Teams channel. So you may want to keep that in mind with the questions that you have, making sure that you're not being too specific about any students who might be able to be identified by what you say. Also, just knowing that what you say is going to be distributed to other people, so you may want to keep that in mind. If you have more sensitive questions or specific questions about student issues, you are welcome to contact either Justin or myself about those questions, and we are happy to discuss anything with you. So you don't need to feel concerned about what you want to ask us, but we just want you to know this is somewhat of a public space, so you may want to just think about what you say here. We do have a Q&A function on, at least for me, when I look at it, it's the bottom right hand of my screen. And we would like for you to put questions there if you have them as we go along, or you can jot them down. We're going to get through our presentation part first, just so that we don't have you asking questions that we're going to answer later on. Typically, we're pretty interactive, and after we get through the few slides that we have, we will definitely be happy to interact more, but we want to make sure that we get through the information that we have. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So a couple of things that we want to talk about. We're not talking a lot here about the actual accommodation, but we do want you to think a little bit about it to give you some context. So we would love, this is going to be our one chat thing. If you could put in the chat, what are some of the disability related reasons why students miss class? So whatever your thoughts are, what you've seen in your classes, what students have told you, or what you think could be a reason that a student might miss class related to their disability. Okay, so health issues. Wow, put the exact same thing. Chronic medical conditions, overwhelmed. Okay, doctor's appointments, fatigue, migraines, changing medications. Yeah, recurring treatment, needing a mental health day, so not just physical necessarily. Lots of anxiety. Sometimes mobility issues, hopefully not too much of that as we work to make our campus accessible from a mobility standpoint. But if they have a chronic health condition or mobility that is flaring up for them, yeah, maybe having trouble. Maybe they did okay in the morning, but then they're really struggling by the time it gets to later in the day, typically related to some kind of chronic health condition. Yeah, so lots of very similar things. We did want you to know that there is a process for determining this accommodation. So a joke a little bit depends. Hopefully, I see a lot of faces that are close to my age. This might make sense to you. We are not Oprah over here in my office saying you get a attendance accommodation and you get an attendance accommodation and you get an attendance accommodation. There really is a process for that. And that process is basically the process for any kind of accommodation. But students do submit an application on our website, including any kind of documentation that they have. They meet with an access coordinator. We typically call them ACs in our office. So we do have access coordinators for each college. And then through an interactive process where the access coordinator is talking to the student, they're looking at that documentation, talking about barriers that the student has experienced either in high school or maybe they experienced them in college if they had not gotten registered with us early in their college career. And then through that conversation, we determine the appropriate accommodations. And then we do talk to them about what is the process for actually getting those accommodations. So what are the students' responsibilities for following through with that accommodation? So, Justin. So what we call that accommodation here is plan for absences and missed deadlines. And Justin likes to call it PAMD. I can't think of the acronym, so I'm always talking about absences. Some schools, if you've been at another school, they may call it flexible attendance. We used to call it modified attendance. I don't love the flexible attendance word because to me that sounds like they just get to pick and choose whether they come to class. And that's really not what it's intended for. Really, this accommodation is intended to be, it's intended to promote reasonable flexibility. And that reasonable word is going to come up a few times as we go through the presentation for disability related absences. So this is, I am out because of my disability. And typically it is those kind of things that you talked about. So it is chronic illness, chronic mental health kind of issues, things that would flare up. You know, you hear that word a lot nowadays. So it is something typically that is unanticipated. So I know I saw some things about doctor's appointments. Typically, a doctor's appointment would not be covered on this. However, there are times where there may be a student that has a condition where they see a specialist, and some of you may have experienced this kind of situation where the specialist only has clinics, you know, for whatever their condition is, once a month on a Thursday afternoon. Well, if that is the situation, then the student may have to miss class that for that. It is not intended to miss a class for appointments that could be scheduled at a different time. But it really is for things that are, we can't predict in the future. We don't know ahead of time, like months ahead of time. And so it really is that disability related absence. What is a little bit different than probably what we've been doing before is that we are really focusing on the flexibility and what is reasonable for the class, not for the student. So Justin's going to continue to talk about that a little bit more. But what that means is basically what I keep saying is how much is too much? So in your class, depending on what you're teaching, the way you're teaching it, whether it's collaborative, whether it's labs, whether you are just flat, straight out lecturing, the number of absences that would be okay to miss without missing too much information to really get the benefit of the class is going to be different. So what we are working with our flex plan with is determining how much is appropriate for your class. And we use the word reasonable a lot because that is a word that is a legal word. So what is reasonable as far as an accommodation goes? We've worked on this quite a bit with faculty in a few different ways. So in summer of 2024, we came up with some default parameters. So not what a faculty member has to use, but some suggestions of how much they could use as far as how many absences would be okay, because I know that can be hard to just come up with on your own. And we've got quite a bit of information that is available that Justin provided the link in the presentation here. We will send you all the presentation, so you'll have that information. You're welcome to take a picture too if you want to, but that information is all there, probably more than you want to know because Justin's super thorough. But he's
I
going
love
to talk
data.
a little bit more here about the process.
Yeah, for sure. And while we're on this slide, because the word is here and it's important to me, Christy mentioned, that word flexible and maybe some of the challenges that come along with that. I love that the accommodation itself is called plan for absences and missed deadlines. The students that are eligible for this accommodation, we know that by nature of their disability, it's very likely that they will miss a day or two in the semester. And it is so much easier to manage that when we have a plan for that. And so you will notice that as we use language and we talk about the structure of this accommodation and this new flex plan tool, these words are really intentional. They're intentional because it really sets up expectations about how things work and what they're intended to accomplish. And really that plan, that proactive sort of thought process that goes into working ahead is very important. So we are really data driven and have been very data driven with this accommodation, not operating in a vacuum, not operating in a silo, really trying to get input and information about how this fits in the broader context of the institution, our student population, what faculty are hearing, seeing, experiencing. And so I did a little bit of data diving in our database and through some institutional information. And during fall 21 to fall 2024, our office saw a 45.1% growth in total number of students. That fall 2024 semester, 6,162 affiliated students. At the same time, TAMU as an institution saw an 8.5% increase. Already, we're not noticing a startling difference in growth, right? Um, for students with plan for absences and missed deadlines, during that fall 2021 semester, those were 16.4% of all students who were eligible for accommodations. That number dropped to 10.9% by fall 2024, 728. Okay. Now, it's too early to really say anything about fall 2025. I could make some projections, but as it stands now, we only have 495 students who are eligible for this accommodation. So already in 1 year, you're seeing a drastic drop. And I think part of that is, we are having really thoughtful discussions about what this accommodation looks like. And being very, very intentional in how we collaborate with students, how we collaborate with faculty. And I think that is making a difference. That number is about half of what it was in fall 2021. And I know that a lot of times we'll say, well, it seems like there's more of these students with this accommodation. Truthfully, there's not. And so I think we will see that number continue. One other thing that's not on this slide that I think is important to remember is sometimes when you see data and you don't see the trend from thing to thing to thing, sometimes you can miss outliers. I tracked fall and spring semesters between 21 to 24, and then including spring 25 and fall 25. There was not a single outlier where that number didn't dip from semester to semester. Not one semester did that number hold steady or rise. And so it has continuously gone down.
Justin, can I say one more thing real quick? I think
Yeah.
one thing that happened also during that time period is that we started using what we call occasional absences
Mm,
as an accommodation. So we do have a fair number of students who come in and they may say, I'm diagnosed with a seizure disorder. I haven't had a seizure in 3 years, but I want an accommodation just in case. Or
right.
I have diabetes and
Diabetes.
I've been fine, but just in case. And that's where we're usually using that occasional absences accommodation, which means there's a little bit less work involved sometimes in that because we're not developing a plan. The student it's a little bit more flexible, and that may sound like, well, what do we do with that? We really haven't seen challenges with that one as much because it says 1 to 2 absences. So if a student does start having more absences than that, then we say we probably need to develop a plan and let's have more of a conversation. But I think
Great
that's
point.
also helped is that we were giving that accommodation, I hate to say inappropriately, but somewhat because they wanted it just in case, which wasn't really what the accommodation was designed for.
Well, and to your point, Christy, I think we've refined how we approach barriers in the environment and in the individual. And so I think our thought process has changed and has evolved in good ways. And so it's kind of the way the nature of this work goes, right? So so what is Flex Plan? Right? We talked a little bit about the accommodations. Flex Plan is not the accommodation. Flex Plan is really the tool. We had an update to our case management system, AIM. You've probably heard of AIM Accommodations Portal, AIM Instructor Portal, in mid-May. That gave us the ability to use this new Flex Plan feature. And actually, I'll tell you, we were one of the very last schools, very last large schools that moved to AIM version 5. So we benefited in sort of seeing some colleagues at other SEC schools, other large schools, who had started using AIM 5 and who had started using this Flex Plan tool. And when we knew that it was available through some of our faculty working group discussions on this accommodation last summer, we really knew it was something that we wanted to pilot during the second summer session. Flex Plan is a questionnaire that is a big part of the tool. It's a questionnaire that gathers proactively information about the course. about the expectations, about the activities, and how these relate to the objectives and the outcomes of the course. And then there's a dashboard that tracks use of how students use that accommodation throughout the semester, right? So you as an instructor say, here are parameters, here are guidelines where maybe my course, my activities, my policies can be flexible, can be amenable to students who experience unexpected and excused type absences, right? It's not asking for excessive, but it is saying, where might be a reasonable bound that you could say beyond what is stated we can work with. And then that dashboard then allows the student to go in and communicate, I need to use this because of my disability. What is very important to note is FlexPlan in no way changes the plan for absence and missed deadlines accommodation. The only things that have been tweaked in that accommodation are really references to references to FlexPlan because it is a new tool. I'll give you a good example. In the plan for absences and missed deadlines accommodation language, there's a section that specifically calls out communication expectations for the student, right? Because timely communication, a lot of our language was mirrored after existing language in the Student Rule 7, which talks about timely notification of absences. And that section now references the disability-related absence notification form that is built into the student side of FlexPlan. So they will submit that, and you will get an email noting that their absence was related to their disability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So why did we opt for this? What is appealing about this? What was the motivation? So in summer 2024, we surveyed about 1,400 instructors. We heard from about 212 as a response to that survey. And 37% of instructors who responded to the survey said that they had experienced challenges with this plan for absences and missed deadlines accommodation. Many of those challenges were related to communication and clear expectations. Communication from the student when an absence occurred, communication from the student at the beginning of the semester, because we didn't really have a questionnaire that was really being used widely to sort of get some of that information. And that kind of ties into that expectation management, right? When the student doesn't know what expectations are in place for how their accommodation is going to be facilitated, it can be challenging. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here as we move on the slide about what those conversations have looked like. It supports proactive, transparent, and collaborative discussion on the accommodation, right? Because the tool runs through the AIM portal. It involves a questionnaire that's reviewed by our staff, and we can have an interactive discussion about what that looks like. And I'll tell you more as we look at the process about how some instructors have been using that already so far this fall. And then finally, the Office of Civil Rights has said that students don't really need to be in the position of negotiating accommodations. And the reality is without us gathering some of that information, some of the finer mechanics about how an accommodation is facilitated could very easily sort of wander into that area of negotiation. Whether there is or isn't, there is a perceived power differential when a student meets with an instructor, right? You've got somebody that's responsible for their grade, somebody that makes decisions about their progress through the course, and that conversation can feel very intimidating to students. And I have talked to a number who they don't know where to go with it. And so what I like about FlexPlan is it sets up a structure for the discussion. It doesn't negate our opportunity to talk with students, to talk with one another, but it does structure that conversation on the front end to collect the right information to know how to facilitate the accommodation well from class to class. So I want to talk a little bit about the process, how it works. There are a number of components that sort of happen. This list makes it look very intimidating, but it's almost so seamless and you don't always see all of the parts. So I'll go over it from start to finish. First thing is first, the student has to request accommodations, and one of those accommodations has to be the plan for absences and missed deadlines accommodation. When they check that box, as it always has, that accommodation will appear on their letter. And the accommodation actually references a link to a tutorial on how to complete the flex plan. You'll receive that accommodation letter, and it will prompt you to complete a flex plan. And then you will get a reminder within 24 hours, hey, there's a flex plan available. There is a reminder interval schedule that stops once that flex plan is completed. We have it set right now to receive 3 reminders over a period of a couple of weeks, like a week and a half. But you'll get a reminder to go in, and we really do try to make that process simple. The AIM reminders give you a link to your instructor portal. But if you get that letter and you want to go ahead and just log into the instructor portal and complete that agreement, there's 8 simple questions that allow you to jump in and get that done. No reminders whatsoever, but you will get the reminders if there's not one completed. Our staff will review the flex plan, right? We'll review what you put in the questionnaire about attendance, about missed deadlines, about participation points, quizzes and exams, lab activities, things of that nature. And we're giving it a pass to make sure that there's something measurable, there's something specific about that plan. We'll make sure that it doesn't detail a specific student, right? Because as Christy mentioned, the biggest notable thing about FlexPlan is you're determining flexibility based on the course and the activities, not the individual needs of the student. So, what you wouldn't do is, oh, well, I'm happy to give Jane Aggie 6 absences because of XYZ, right? Because any other student with the accommodation is also subject to the same flex plan. And we're not tailoring it to that individual student, we're tailoring it to the class, right? And we're reviewing that to make sure that responses fit sort of categorically what's being asked of the question. I came into the fall semester recognizing this is a very new thing. From a paradigm perspective, this totally shifts how we've approached this accommodation in the past, right? If you've been here long enough, like I have, you've seen the old paper modified attendance agreements, and a lot of those questions were about the student. They were about what barriers the student felt and experienced, right? And this is really, talk to me about your class. And so there's a lot of coaching and learning that goes into this. There's a lot of unlearning about what the accommodation isn't, right? The accommodation isn't an open-ended excused absence. The accommodation isn't promoting excess, right? Equity is about balance. This accommodation is about buffer. Buffer doesn't necessarily have an unrestricted and unbridled sort of approach to accommodating the student. And it's okay to set reasonable limits, right? Reasonable is going to look different from class to class, but as we engage with that questionnaire, it gives us an opportunity to review it and say, hey, you said this, tell me more about that. Or, hey, you said students have 4 days to complete XYZ assignment. How long does it take them to complete that assignment? Because I might not necessarily advocate for an extra few days if that assignment takes 5 minutes and they've got 4 days to do a 5-minute assignment, right? And so that allows us to engage in that discussion. If, when we review that, there are questions, there's actually a really nice section on our side where we can put in comments, we can put in suggested revisions, and those get emailed directly to the instructor. Several of you have gotten those. I saw names of folks in the room. Several of you have gotten those, and I've put in comments about, hey, on question 7, you said this. Here's something I'm thinking, or on Q2, you said, there really isn't any, you'll work with the student, right? You'll work with the student based on their needs. Well, that doesn't really tell me about how many absences is too many absences. And so kind of trying to get at why this answer exists the way it does. It's not challenging, it's teaching, it's coaching, right? And we're learning together. Once that is approved, you and the student both get a confirmation with a list of your responses, right? So it's an email. It's also posted to your FlexPlan dashboard, both for the student and the instructor. Student is then able to go into their FlexPlan dashboard and submit disability-related absence notifications. And what these essentially are is it's a very short questionnaire for the student that says, what day were you absent? If it was a period of days, state that period. What flexibility or what ways are you trying to use this accommodation? Is it simply an excused absence? Was there a deadline that you missed? Did you miss an exam? Is there something else we need to know? And then in the timeline of when the absence happened and when you're submitting this request, is this before you missed? Is it the day of? Is it outside of that 2 business days that's sort of expected of students to communicate? And if they answer it's outside of that 2 business days, you might want context. We might want context. It might be inappropriate to approve that if they didn't follow the guidelines and that communications expectation. There may have been a valid reason why they didn't. And so we can kind of engage in that discussion to help bridge the gap. Instructor and our office can approve, they can view, they can dispute. When those things are disputed, the access coordinator gets brought into that discussion from start to finish. And then that way you've got somebody on this side who has some disability specific context that can help you consider how you move forward with that. And it's okay to dispute these things, but if we dispute them, we have to have a conversation about it. We have to have rationale as to why we're disputing it. And then finally, most importantly, there's a history of how this is used throughout the semester. And so if you say 3 absences is too many, and we see a student at 3 absences or 4 absences, well, now we know we're operating outside the bounds of the agreement, and we need to know what we're going to do with that. And that might be a conversation on our end with the student to say, hey, based on the learning outcomes and objectives of this course, we might need to explore other options. I've got a picture here that kind of gives an overview of the questionnaire. We did modify this a little bit for the fall semester. A couple things that we changed was the language around the number of absences. So how many absences, or at what point would there be too many disability related absences where a student might not be successful in a course? And we also added a question about lab activities, because a lot of classes you might have a 4-hour class where there are lab activities, and we don't want this to just be about the lecture portion, right? The lab might have specific parameters that need to be considered there as well. I also have a picture here of the disability-related absence notification, where the student fills out their questionnaire. As soon as they submit this, you get an email, student gets an email, access coordinator gets an email, and it really just sort of heightens, that puts it on your radar. And again, you can manage these inside of your FlexPlan dashboard as an instructor. So I want to talk a little bit about how FlexPlan has been used so far. We did run a pilot during the summer 2025 semester, second term, and we had 204 courses that were part of that pilot. We did have 55 flex plans that were completed. That was about 27%. And 11 individual disability-related absence notifications were sent through that portal. Here in a little bit, I'm going to share a note from a student who actually submitted one of those, because I was really curious about what students felt about this, right? A lot of times we think about, the work that it's going to create for us or the things that we're doing, but what is the impact for the student? We did survey and gather feedback from how that pilot was used. Of the 55 instructors who had flex plans submitted, I think it ended up sending, I think I sent an email to, I think it was 55. 16 instructors completed, 16 who completed that flex plan were given a survey, and that was about 29% who responded. 75% of those who responded agreed that flex plan was really straightforward and that the instructions were helpful. 62.5% indicated that they felt like FlexPlan would help them better facilitate the plan for absences and missed deadlines accommodation in future semesters. We also did survey those who didn't complete the FlexPlan for that summer 2 pilot. And truthfully, I will follow my sword a little bit. We had a very quick rollout, right? From the time that we got new AIM to set up a new module to get communications out, and just the way AIM functions, it doesn't let us do real world testing until you move semesters. And the way we had to manage the accommodation, there were some technical things that we had to work through that kind of compressed our timeline a little bit. Of the challenges that folks noted, even the ones who did fill out the plan, they really did feel like communication was a little tight on that. That's why we're trying to be proactive this fall. But some of the challenges that folks who didn't fill out the flex plan, 18 responded, and that was 12%. 52.9% said they were just unaware. They didn't know that they had a flex plan to complete. And if you don't know what something is, you may not feel compelled to fill it out. And so I totally get that. 14.7% didn't really understand the purpose a flex plan? Why are we doing it, right? And so we really do want to take a harder look at what are the resources, right? Is it video? Is it text? Is it workshops? Like, how can we better get resources in instructors' hands so they understand why we're doing what we're doing with this? Um, most folks who had open-ended comments, so they really wanted more individual conversations with students, um, or felt the plan was overbearing. And so when you're thinking about this point, right, individual conversation with students isn't negated by flex plan, right? It is wholly necessary and appropriate to still have an individual conversation with your students, right? Especially as needs arise throughout the semester, there may be context to that situation that allow you to reconsider something, right? So we should be having individual conversations with our students. But if we're thinking about developing a plan that's based on the course, the activities, and the policies, that's separate from individual student needs, right? And so Flex Plan, both can exist, but Flex Plan can and should be filled out independently without individual student barriers in mind. And then finally, overbearing. We're not asking for the accommodation to be something that it's not, right? Yes, the accommodation spells out some default guidelines. Those guidelines are spelled out not because they're prescriptive, but because a lot of instructors said, I just have no idea where to start with this, right? And you may have a plan that has worked for you for many, many semesters, and that's okay. We can document that in the flex plan. This is not asking for excess. It's asking for us to document what is possible and our rationale for it. And that doesn't have to be a lengthy narrative, though you're more than welcome to put whatever you want to put. But your parameter based on the pedagogy, the design, the delivery of your course, and the rationale by which those policies exist, that's the most important part. I will say, even some that didn't fill it out, they said, I love this. Now I understand it, and I can't wait to use it for fall. So you got a little mix of everything in and that list of survey responses. So what are students saying about this, right? We had a number of students who were involved in the pilot. I'm sorry I didn't gather specific numbers, but I had 3 that submitted disability-related absence notifications, and I talked with a couple of them. They really liked how easy and straightforward it was. They felt like it took the stress out of the experience, and I'll touch on that more in just a second. They appreciate that it also loops the access coordinator into the discussion. They say that it emphasizes collaboration with all involved because we really are genuinely a team, right? We each bring a perspective to this conversation that is important for us to land in the right spot. And so I did want to share a little bit from a student who I spoke with as a result of filling this out. Some of the things she said really echo what I just shared. You know, in the past, communication has been a challenge. She'll mention that she'll send an email to the instructor, and sometimes communication is great, and sometimes it isn't, right? And that can be stressful for students when they're trying to do their best to reach out, and communication just sort of falls on its face. She said that when she used this in the AIM portal, it was straightforward. She knew what she needed to supply, and she knew she got it routed to the right person. She said once she got used to the new system, she felt a lot more comfortable than the old way. I like how the disability office and access coordinator know about the situation, so that her access coordinator and the instructor can all be on the same page. And that's really, really important. And then this last comment was really important to me, and I'm going to try to read it in its entirety. She said, side note, I have always been paranoid that a professor is going to think less of me when I use this accommodation or use it against me. My biggest wish is that professors knew that this was literally my last resort, and I'm absolutely desperate when I use it. When professors express being displeased with my request, it only heightens and causes my symptoms to flare up worse. And she talks about how even just not having a streamlined process can exacerbate the symptoms that necessitated the accommodation to begin with. And I'll tell you, sometimes we forget that. Sometimes I forget that, right? Policies, processes, procedures. We've got students that we're asking them to engage in this, and that very engagement could actually be exacerbating the very reason they need the thing that they have. And so I thought that was an incredibly powerful thing and a really bold and brave thing for her to share, and I appreciate it. So I want to talk a little bit real quick about the Flex Plan questionnaire. What are the questions designed to get at? And so how many absences might be possible before a student is unable to successfully meet the outcomes of your course, right? Because when we plan a course, when we deliver that to students, we have outcomes and objectives that we set that to be successful in that class, you have to meet those outcomes and objectives. And disabled students do too, right? Accommodations can't negate the need to meet outcomes and objectives. At what point does attendance, participation, presence, timely completion of work impact a student's ability to meet objectives? That's going to look different from class to class. That's why you don't look at this accommodation and see highly prescriptive language, because you are in the best position to tell us what that looks like. How can students make up participation activities, right? And that's going to look different from activity to activity. There's some suggestions on that form, on that questionnaire. Maybe it's a reflective exercise. Maybe it's touching base and coming and talking to the instructor. Maybe there is no penalty. Maybe you don't use participation activities. And then there's always another field. So if those default options don't work for you, specify what might work for you. And you know what? If there's not something that works for you, say that. Based on this activity, I don't know how I would make this work, and here's why. And then we can have a discussion about it. And then if there genuinely is no way to do it, then we've documented it and we've talked about it. And that's really the most important part. We've got to engage in that exploration. What happens if an absence occurs during an exam or a quiz? How are we going to handle that, right? Plan for absences, flex plan. Let's plan for what that looks like. Can short-term deadlines be flexible? I use the word short-term very deliberately because I think of short-term as daily and weekly assignments. You may have an assignment that takes a month, that might take the entire semester. And I know when we assign those types of things, we're not expecting that quite literally every second of every day of every week of that month that student's working on that assignment. And so this accommodation might be inappropriate given the types of activities that you're doing, right? And so if it is a shorter turnaround, a shorter timeline, that daily to weekly, it might look more appropriate. And again, I've looked at now, and I'll tell you data here in just a second about current fall use, but I've looked at a lot of these. And I've gotten a number of instructors that say, I give my students 5 days to complete an assignment. And when I read that, it's a little less than a week. So I kind of like, there's gray area there. Let's talk about that. 5 days, okay? What's the assignment? How long does it typically take students to complete? Well, it takes students to about 15 minutes to complete it. All right, well, that might be appropriate, right? And so maybe this doesn't apply to this, but the only way we find out is we talk about it. And then finally, obviously, short-term assignments, tests, participation, that's not the only activities we do in class. And so it's important that we look at those other activities, presentations, group work, peer reviews, team-based projects, things of that nature. And so I pulled a couple of responses from current flex plans that I felt like I would share with you about attendance and about participation and about other activities. And so let me pull these up real quick. So some of the responses we've gotten on the attendance and absences portion, there's an A-led class that talks about focusing on participation. They say up to 5 absences would still allow for adequate participation with the course. That there's required presence and attendance for content and delivery. This is related to special guests and interaction with peers and the instructor. One kinesiology instructor said 1 absence is allowed because new skills and activities are introduced each session, and every single one of those builds on one another, right? And so that could be important. And those are practiced through participation and interaction with the instructor. Another AGLS instructor said that for a 15-week course that meets once a week, 3 absences would allow the student to still be successful and complete work that's done in class. A TEFB class noted that 3 absences were allowed because the Texas Education Agency says that there's an 80-20 standard that students have to be in class at least 80% of the time. And so we can point to a technical standard, right? A certifying body that says, here's the standard, right? That's important information. A psychology and brain sciences class said 3 absences once a week. I'm sorry, it's a once a week class. 3 absences would not disrupt the flow of class. And they say that class participation is primarily evaluated on active engagement in class, asking questions, sharing ideas, and taking part in activities, right? And so those are essential requirements to be able to demonstrate participation and knowledge. There was for participation, an ag economics class talked about how it's a writing intensive course and working with TAs and the instructor is essential to success. And so they limited that to 3 absences. For participation, a math class talked about how they will drop 2 iClicker quizzes when students miss. They don't have an attendance policy, but they do measure participation based on iClickers. They'll drop 2 for every student, but they'll drop 4 for students who experience disability-related barriers. And so that may be one way to do it. A philosophy class talked about how bonus points are allowed, are given through preparatory work that's done ahead of class time. 100% of the grade can be achieved through exams, but the idea is that equitable access wouldn't penalize disabled students for being absent for a disability-related need if it is reasonable and feasible to make up those bonus points, right? And so because these are open ahead of class time, that allows that student to also get the bonus points as well. And then additional activities, one I'll share with you, another psychology and brain sciences class talked about a team-based consulting project that's a major assignment. Because this assignment involves delivering a final product to a client, operates on a tight schedule, and requires teams to assign roles and manage deadlines internally, it's not feasible to treat this the same way as another assignment. That they encourage that they could help broker communication with the group or encourage the student, kind of coach them through some ways that they could work through that with their group themselves. And so there are lots of ways to approach this. And I will tell you, most importantly, put it on the document. And if it's a question, you can even question, or you can email us and we're happy to talk through, here's what I'm thinking, is that okay? Right? Because the best part of FlexPlan is that it's interactive and collaborative. And I didn't put data, I thought I had a slide after this about data on how FlexPlan is already currently being used. So for our pilot, we had a 26.2% response rate in the 4 weeks that we ran the pilot. We got the 55 flex plans, like I mentioned. Already, after opening up FlexPlan for fall 2025, I have individually and personally reviewed almost 180 flex plans. And the response rate now currently for flex plans already before classes start is right over 31%. Let me tell you something. I've been here long enough to see those paper modified attendance forms. We might have gotten 10 back. And remember, that was almost 800 students with this accommodation, 10 forms back. This semester, I have 576 requests for plan for absences already out and already 180 flex plans completed. That's incredible. And what it does is it positions us to work as a team to help negotiate what this flexible attendance can look like. And when it can't work the way, if it can't work in your class, then we can talk about it proactively rather than finding out in the moment that it doesn't work. And that's just a whole big ball of yarn to untangle. The last slide I have here is just thinking about how the future of FlexPlan looks, right? As you think about that questionnaire, what are questions that are missing, right? What are things that we could be asking that would help us identify some of these things a little bit better? What resources would help you develop your own resources a little bit more effectively? What are some sticking points that you still feel like need to be addressed with this accommodation? And then how do we continue to improve clarity and collaboration when it comes to accommodations, specifically related to attendance and deadlines? But I'm going to tell you, had a lot of philosophical discussions on what accommodations are. And I think the more dialogue we have about our role, and how accommodations fit your classroom, it really allows us to recognize that we're on the same team. In fact, I had a response to some flex plan feedback that I gave to an instructor, and they said, "Hey, I made the corrections that you had suggested. I just want to let you know it's instructors are getting thrown a lot these days. We're being asked to do a lot of things, a lot of new things, and some of them are really, really heavy. But I just want to let you know it's a really helpful reminder to know that we have people that are on our team and that are partners with us. And I hold that very close to my heart because partnership is really at the heart of what our office does.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize a couple of things, and then we do have some questions that I'm primarily going to ask Justin. So, one thing is to know, and I appreciate that. I think it was Larry that brought it up. The question disappeared after I said I answered it. Um, but is that right now, Justin is reviewing every flex plan that comes into our department. And that's because we needed to figure out how this whole thing works. We wanted to make sure we were consistent. Then he's hearing those conversations with faculty members, and I think he can be a really great resource for this is what I do, how do I do it here? Another thing I wanted to emphasize is that when Justin's reviewing the flex plans, he's not evaluating them to say, like, you're wrong, you didn't do this right, or like, you can't do this. This
Yep,
is your class,
that's right.
and you're the expert on what you're teaching, how you're teaching it. You know what the format is. And so that's why I know we had a question from someone about why is the instructor doing this?
Hmm.
It's because we can't tell you how many absences is okay because everyone teaches differently across this university. And believe me, sitting where we sit, we get to see so many different ways of evaluating and teaching and all the different things that are amazing that are happening on this campus. So he is there as a resource. He is reviewing them. And when he's coming back to you, usually it's a question of like, do you think that's really going to work? Or like, wow, that's not specific enough. Or, hey, have you thought about this? Or he may be saying it's great. Like, we're good. You've got it. We're good. So I did want to make sure you didn't think he was there judging or evaluating. He
Not
is
at
there
all.
to help. And then the other thing, Justin did make the point here, but the big thing, one of the really big advantages is that we are in the loop of the communication now.
Yep.
So if a student submits a disability related absence, we see that. And so we can then be knowing, oh, this student is getting close to the amount that they're missing. We need to reach out, we need to help out. A lot of times in the past, what's happened is we get near the end of a semester and a faculty member contacts us and says, there's a student that's missed 15 classes. What am I supposed to do? And at that point, we're all in a pickle because we don't really know at that point. It's probably too much. But then, does the student know that? So I think the communication piece is super important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, to that point and kind of bringing a couple of things together, the goal of this, as you set parameters and we talk about communication, the goal of our work is access. It's equitable access. The goal of this accommodation is not necessarily to guarantee a student gets to the finish line. I want to see every student win, right? Like you've invested money, you've invested time, you've invested energy. I want to see you cross that finish line. But we're trying to set up some reasonable parameters that give them access to get to that finish line. And there are choices that they will have to make along the way as to whether now with that access, can I do it? And you know what? Sometimes disabled students, things can happen, and we've got to make different decisions about how they progress in that class. And there have been conversations I've had to have with students where attendance is a challenge. It's a requirement. You're missing the objective of this course. Maybe it is a class you need to Q drop. But when we're not in that communication loop, we can't have those discussions and we can't be a resource to you and you say, I can't do this anymore, right? I've exhausted all of my options. Without that communication loop, we don't have any context, and it really doesn't serve anyone well.
Okay, Justin, we got a lot of questions. So I'm going to
Let's do
ask,
it.
you're going to go quick. So one
Let's
is we have
go.
several people who've said that they got the email saying they had a student, but when they look in the portal, there's nothing there. There's not a student with that accommodation,
Hmm.
or they don't see the flex plan menu to fill in the information on the portal. My one answer was it could be that the students dropped the class, but is there any other reason they wouldn't?
No, and I'd want to triage that a little bit. So let me drop an email address in the chat. We do now have a dedicated email for Flex Plan inquiries, and I'll give you that email address. Email is
Okay.
er-flexplan@tamu.edu.
Okay, so the best thing to do would be to email us just so we can double check and make sure, again, since it's new for us, we're still kind of figuring it out. We couldn't actually see any of this until after May 19th, I think is when we
That's
switched
right.
to the new version of AIM. So we have definitely had a learning curve here too. We have been asked about having examples of how to fill out the flex plan, Justin. So potentially we could put more information on our website with some examples of that.
One thing that I've been doing is I've been trying to kind of collect as I go along some really good examples. I mean, I shared some snippets in this discussion, but I agree with you. I think case studies, examples, those are resources that I think could be very helpful.
Yes. Um, some of these you're going to have to email our note-taking thing because they're a little complicated or have a phone conversation. Justin lives for this stuff right
I
now. He
really do.
loves it.
I really, really do. I'm telling you, hey, you know what? Honestly, okay, great, email me. But if you want to go grab coffee, like I'm also down for that. Caffeinated Justin is a good Justin.
Okay, so, and some of the more specific ones. So, Dr. Mock asked about using clickers in class. He doesn't offer makeups, but the student only needs 70% of the total points to get full credit. Is this valid? I would say the answer that happens in our world all the time is it depends. We'd probably
Mhm.
want to talk through it before making a definitive answer. So, I think that would probably be a good just in discussion. It definitely might be, but we have
It,
to
it,
be a
it could
little
be.
careful when we get to some of those things. One of the things that Justin and I have been talking about a little bit is a difference with this versus like extended time on tests is we're determining what's reasonable for the class. And if you have a very flexible policy already, you don't have to do more than that because the student has a disability. So if you determine, if a student, any student misses more than, I'm going to throw out a number. Don't use this for anything. If we say if any student misses more than 10 classes, they really can't make an A in my class or whatever. That could be fine, and you don't have to extend that. So that's where Justin's having some of this conversations with faculty to determine more particularly. I know for you it's super clear, but it's helpful for us to have a little bit more conversation around those kinds of things.
Well, and 70% of five is very different than 70% of 15, right? And so sometimes if I were to get just that, like they've got to complete 70%, I'd probably ask how many? How many total iClicker opportunities do you give? And if getting 70%, how many are they missing to get to that point? So those would be questions I would ask. Is that
Yeah.
interactive process with the Flex Plan?
Justin, do you have the link to the instructor portal?
Yeah,
I'm I
I
am
sure
not as
do.
tech savvy as Justin. When I try to go to it, it wants me to log in and I'm not an instructor. So we can put the link. So the portal is our AIM portal. It's accessible information management. It's what we do. That's how we send our letters out. It's how we do our testing agreements. It's where we track exams. All of that is in the AIM portal. We have realized some people don't realize that a portal exists. They think we just send out letters, but you can log into that portal. You can see what the accommodations are for your student. The flex plan is there if you have a student with a flex plan. So all of that. So that hopefully will be helpful to you. It's on our website also. So if you go to the disability.tamu.edu website on the right-hand side, there's a place that says AIM portal and it has instructor login and you can click there and you log in with your NetID and password and you can get in there. Um, okay. So it is possible. It sounds like several people do not have students listed. So I don't know if students are dropping classes right now. It's very possible.
Well, and I thought of something, right? Like literally as you said that comment. You know who got this email? And I said in the email when you got it, that we pulled a list targeting instructors who could
Mm.
have a student in their class that is eligible to request an accommodation that would trigger flex plan. Your students may not have asked for the accommodation yet, right? And we're still a couple of days away before the semester starts. You're not going to see it until that plan for absences and missed deadlines accommodation is triggered by the student. But I do think it's really good to know before you get that email what the heck the email is. And so I'm glad you showed up, but I'm also not surprised that you're not seeing flex plan because the list was a little bit broader because we knew we wanted to touch interaction with folks who might be affected by it.
Yes, and somebody said that after clicking on the class request, then they could see that it was there. So if you get some of those quirky things, let us know
Let
because
us know.
one, it's possible there's something on our end that we need to adjust. It's also possible with the system itself. Sometimes there are some quirky things and they are very responsive to us making changes if we need to. There is no deadline for students to request an accommodation. So beyond when we get close to finals, they can't request that they get final exam accommodations in our office just because of our space issues. However, accommodations are not retroactive. So if a student requests an attendance accommodation and they've already missed 10 classes, those classes don't count in the plan. And you can definitely contact us at that point to figure out what we do moving forward. We do ask students to request their letters early. We send them emails to remind them. We've been calling some new students, so we do tell them to get in as quickly as they can. Okay, yes, students can request accommodations or not for every class. So we did have a question about, so students, we determine their accommodations, but they may say, you know what? So testing is an easier accommodation to think about. They may say there's no exams in this class, so I'm not going to request testing accommodations for this class. So they get to pick and choose whether they want their letters sent to every instructor or not, and then what accommodations they want for those classes. I'm gonna try to see if there's anything uh, that is kind of a more universal. There were a couple of questions about, so for multi-section course coordinators, can we pre-build a flex plan even if a student hasn't requested it? Justin, can they do that in AIM? They can do it outside of AIM and then just enter when a student has requested it, but
They can do it outside of AIM. I think this is one area that will be a little tricky with some of these coordinated courses. I have a plan. I have an approach that has happened with some of the smaller ones, but one thing I think I would like to change for future questionnaires is to indicate if a lab section is present, that the instructor save the flex plan but not submit it, or they submit it and I just automatically reopen it so that a lab coordinator or somebody else can come and enter that information. TBD on how we handle that. I think fall will probably tell us a good solution, but I don't have a great answer for that just yet. And honestly, if you're in one of those coordinated situations, email me and tell me what you think might make most sense.
yeah. And then the other, and we're going to have to end. And I know Justin, you did a great job getting through the slides, but we do want to end on time. Um, and yeah, so some of these it gets real tricky as the work that we do is.
Yeah.
Um, there was a question about the TEA licensure requirements. We do
Yes.
have a way to do that. So just let us know. So that's some of this reasonable discussion. So if
Yep.
there is an outside entity that says students can't miss more than this number of classes, then that's what we put in the plan. So that's really the nice thing is it's very clear. This is exactly
Mhm.
what we can do. And then we know, you know, the student knows, and we're all on the same page. So I am going to end us, Justin. If you want to say any last things, please send an email to that email address that Justin put in if you have questions, because we want to work with you. That's so important. That's part of what we love is this collaborative approach. I also am putting the evaluation again. We evaluate every time we present because we want to make sure you're getting the information you need. And if you have questions that are still there, we can answer them and
I
make sure that we're presenting them.
I specifically ask a question on that evaluation. What questions do you still have? And if you still have one that wasn't answered in this, drop it in there because I'm going to read every single one of these.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening. If you're listening to the recording later, please contact us. Any questions, no matter if you think it's silly or anything else, we want to be here for you and we want to be a resource for you. And we want to be a collaborator and a partner with you and with the students.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.